going to encode all of that with your experiences in your life, and then you're going to interpret. And if the two of us were talking right now, then we would continue this in a feedback loop. All right. So this is a nuclear family. I know this is a little bit limited, but this is just like for diagram's sake, this is what I was able to find. So a lot of family stuff kind of uses like a biological model where we're thinking about like inputs and like homeostasis. So we're using a lot of like scientific kind of biology terms. So we have a family subsystem, right? So we have a family system and then parental subsystem, and then we have like a sibling subsystem. We might have a bigger subsystem, especially if you're working with families, like non-white families. There might be, you know, like aunts, uncles that are part of the system that are very relevant. But this is like a sort of nuclear family model that we have here. So there's a parental subsystem. There's a relationship between the parents with each other, right? There's also a relationship that the siblings have with each other. Now it's more complicated than this too, because there's a relationship between father, daughter, son, wife, or son, mother, right? There's relationships that go all the ways. But we have, so symmetrical relationships are like shared roles. So the son and the daughter are shared equal roles. Although we can argue gender roles, there's differences there. All right. Then the parents are another symmetrical relationship. Complementary relationships are like mother, daughter, father, son, father, daughter, those, right? So parent to child. So we want to acknowledge these because actually a lot of times when family systems are out of whack or unhealthy, it's because these have been subverted in some way. Like where, let's imagine that the son was elevated to the status that the father was, right? So the daughter slash sister is treated like a child, but the son is treated like an adult, even though maybe they're like the same age. Let's pretend they're twins, so that's not a factor. They're both 7 years old. So the son is asked to make adult decisions. The son is privy to the parents' discussions about finances, all of these things. It's not healthy for the family system, right? Because now we're excluding one person. The sister slash daughter is now like in a position where she is excluded and doesn't get to have a relationship, like a symmetrical, normal relationship with her brother, but he's this weird intermediate of slash parent, but he's also being parentified. So he's being put in a role that he's not emotionally and like psychologically equipped for yet. Now, normal parenting, like proper parenting, you'd be giving the kid more and more responsibility and more tasks as they get older. You wouldn't just suddenly elevate one. So we see this kind of thing a lot too, like if there's a death or a divorce, sometimes a parent might confide in one of their children and confide in things that maybe they shouldn't. Like, let's say parents get divorced in this family, and now father starts confiding in his daughter about the mom and saying like, oh, she was so terrible, you know, she never took care of you guys, she was always out late and she was cheating. And now the daughter has this psychological burden, right? So we want, actually, these hierarchies should be maintained to some level. Now, if they're too rigid, that can be a problem too. But we want, see, that's why they have dotted lines. We want them to exist, but not be too rigid. So there should be inputs from the environment and outputs from the environment. We don't want this family to be so insular that nobody can ever talk to them. They're not all like locked in the attic kind of thing. We also want them to be able to interact and have influence on their environment, but not too much influence, where like the parents get the ultimate say, like they have their own way of disciplining and they don't just go with whoever or whatever's happening, right? Okay. Okay, this one's a little blurry, but it was the best diagram I could find. I like these diagrams, they're good. Okay, so talking a little bit about boundaries, right? So the levels of engagement, boundaries. So boundaries range from very rigid. That's where like we cannot change what we do. We are very separate from one another. We are, actually, no, that's different. So there's rigid and there's flexible. So rigid is like we can't change. This is the way it always has and always will be, which lends towards being a little bit more unhealthy. Rigid is usually more unhealthy. Flexible is like we can change with what happens in our lives. So let's say like I get pregnant and now I need my mom to stay with me for 6 months. that's a flexible boundary, because right now I don't want her to stay with me for 6 months. But if I have a baby, maybe I do want her to stay with me. And then at some point it can be flexible again, where I'm like, okay, mom, it's time for you to go home because I think I got this, right? So depending on culture, there's going to be different levels of like how flexible or what types of boundaries are appropriate. Like the scenario I just listed, that maybe wouldn't happen in some families because people would already be living with their parents, their grandparents. Or it wouldn't be a question that someone would come and stay. But we also want it to be able to change. That's what we're looking at. We're not looking at like, my family does this and their family doesn't, so their family's wrong. We're looking at, is this family able to change in a way that most people are like satisfied with the change and nobody's getting the short end of the stick? So we also want to look at, with boundaries, is there what we call enmeshment? Or I think I have another slide on that. It'll probably be in one. So enmeshment is when people feel responsible for each other's feelings. These are the kind of families where there's a lot of what we call triangulation, where like in the last slide, when I was describing the father talking to the daughter about the mom, that's a triangle, it's triangulation. So we want people to be able to talk directly to someone if they're having an issue or a conflict, and have that conflict kind of stay between them, not exclusively between them where it's a secret. But we also want them to be able to be direct and not to have to like go to other people. And enmeshment really means that people don't feel like they can say no typically to someone, like that they have to have this level of closeness. They're afraid that the family will fly apart, that kind of thing. It's the like really out of a motivation of fear. It's different than just closeness. Closeness is great. Closeness is fine. It's just when it's unhealthy closeness, if someone doesn't feel like they can assert themselves, that's when it's enmeshed. So then distant is where people don't share their emotions at all. They don't talk to one another. They avoid interaction. There's lots of examples of this, right? Like I think of like a family that eats dinner together, but no one's talking, or no one's talking about like anything of significance. It's just very surface level. That could be a distant family. You could be physically together, but very distant. And you could be physically very far, but be communicating a lot and sharing a lot emotionally too. Right? Okay, yeah, here we go. Enmeshment versus disengagement. So enmeshment is like, we all have to think and feel alike. We all have to agree. Usually conflicts are squashed or pretended that they're not happening because that's not in the best interest of our relationship, right? Feelings belong to other people. So we're not checking in with our own feelings as much. We're always checking in about other people. Are you mad at me? Are you okay? And I have to say, I think a lot of people who enter in social work have enmeshed families, not like categorically so, but I think that this practice of like checking in and being like, are you okay? How are you doing? And like being the person who's like the receptacle for listening to another person's problem, that lends itself towards having that kind of a background. So if that's you, just be aware of it. Maybe go to therapy about it. Sometimes people lack a sense of self if it's really severe. So sometimes it can be healthy, right? Like I said, a mother and a small baby, like categorically have to be enmeshed. A baby will die without its mother and its father too. But like the mother has the milk. So you have like some situations in life where enmeshment is okay. Think if you have like your parent or maybe like uncle or aunt that you're very close to that has a terminal illness and you have to take care of them. You might become a little bit enmeshed, but that's because you're performing a role for a certain period of time and it's appropriate in that role, right? So disengagement is where people are unaware of the thoughts and feelings. Feelings are very much like shared, but also people are not shared. Feelings are not shared. People fear talking about emotions at all. A lot of times people feel isolated. So this can also be healthy sometimes, especially like, so you think about the family life cycle. When an adolescent gets to a certain age, they do disengage and they want to start their own family or just start their own life separate from their parents. So we want to have the flexibility to be able to kind of move through. So we don't want to be all the way, basically never is it a good idea to be all the way on one polar end of something. So we want to kind of like be in the middle here and be able to bounce back and forth of enmeshment, disengagement. All right, so patterns of communication you might see in family work. Like mystification, like, I don't understand how that's happening. I don't get that at all. The fault defend, like it's your fault, you're doing this. It's, like scapegoating. There's typically like a number of roles that people will fulfill within family systems, and scapegoat is a really popular one. So that's typically like, I think I've heard of it referred to as like the identified patient, which I don't like that. But typically if you are, let's say that you work in an eating disorder clinic, typically the person who has like the eating disorder in the family might be the scapegoat for a lot of the family's issues. And if you start engaging in family therapy, you might start finding out that there were tensions between the parents or tensions with one of the other children. But this person has kind of been elected by the family to have the problem so that they can have a catalyst to go to therapy. Now, do people consciously do this? No. It's like all mostly subconscious, but there is like some, it's like almost a tension release. Like if you think of like a pressure cooker has a tension release, when a family has a lot of tension, sometimes one person tends to take on a lot of it, and then there's a tension release at some point where they have like a disorder. So yeah, something else that you might notice in a family session is what they call dual monologues, people just talking at the same time. So if you can identify these things like at the beginning and just be like, hey, these are things we're not going to do. And then when it comes up, you can be like, nope, we're not going to do that. This is how we're going to do that. That's a good start for family therapy. So some skills you can teach people, and these are just basic like communication skills, right? Like using I messages, I feel, sharing your thoughts without blaming. But then also I think people tend to focus on like sender skills, like when you are communicating, but the receiver skills are probably the more important ones, of like talking about how can we attend to someone, how can we show them that they were listening, how will they know that we've heard them, that kind of thing. And so we probably do this pretty well as people who've chosen to be social workers or therapists. But think, your clients, especially if it's a family system, there's probably a couple people who could use a little primer on like how to do active listening and how to make other people feel heard. So it's good to just model this, but also just talk about it too. All right. Family life cycle. So again, this is culturally based. Like it's hard to find diagrams that are really nuanced, but this is kind of like a Western family life cycle of what's typical. There's 1,000 variations of how this could actually look in a real family. This is like assuming that there's a nuclear family living together. So we could have variations where there's like adolescents living with other relatives, like people going back and forth across a border and staying with different family members. We could have like a young couple that lives with their parents, people who take care of somebody who's elderly, living with grandparents, uncles, cousins, that kind of thing. Okay, but typically we're going to have something where there's like a young adult phase, they don't have children, and then they're two people starting a family, and then their kids getting older, and then they have kind of like an adolescence stage, and then there's like, so your kids are like adults, working age, may or may not be living in the home, but at some point typically will spring out of the home and then start their own couple and then start their own cycle. And then we kind of go with elderly couples. So the whole point of that, like paying attention to the family life cycle, is just noting that there are tensions that occur with each stage of that, and that sometimes families will come to therapy because there's a disconnect between what one person in the family wants from that stage and what another person acknowledges or wants from the stage. Like I'll go back. So like a big tension stage, I would say, is probably like 5 and 1, between those. Like when kids are becoming adults and they're kind of moving on and they're launching, there is a need for parenting to change. There's also a need for the kid to have like a different way of viewing themselves in the world and like to establish their own identity. And so there's a tension of like, how do I establish this identity without being completely disconnected from my parents? And for the parents, there's a tension between like, how do I allow freedom without completely abandoning or putting my child in danger? And how do I conceptualize this person as an adult when I feel that they're a child, right? So then we have explicit and implicit rules. Most of the stuff that we're dealing with in therapy is really more around implicit rules. People will sometimes come in because of explicit rules. Now let's think about like the teenager situation, right? So let's say we have a teenager who is 17, and let's say that they're the oldest, and it's a young woman, and then let's give them brother who's 8. Okay. So maybe the teenager is like, I think I should be able to stay up later. I can only stay up 1 hour later than my 8-year-old brother, and it's embarrassing, and my social life is terrible because I have to come home by midnight or whatever.